verse-by-verse study of God's letter to you, the Bible. And now, here is Dennis Murray. Good day to you. God bless you. Welcome to Shepherd's Chapel. Welcome to this family Bible study hour. Ready to get back into our Father's Word, the book of Leviticus. In our last lecture, we had come to chapter 13 of Leviticus, where the Feast of Yahweh are covered. And you'll recall we started off with a refresher about the Sabbath. I think that was inserted there to make it understood that the Sabbaths were to be taken care of regardless of when the feast fell. That was a given. Then the first feast of the year, of course, the Passover. Following that, the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, matzah in the Hebrew. Then, of course, we had the Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, as it's known, and all the instructions that go along with that. And I'll remind you that there was a harvest in the fall, or in the spring, I should start off with, when the barley and the wheat first started to ripen. And we'll also see in this lecture that there's a harvest in the fall. Harvest, a time of joy within Israel. It was hard work. Any way you look at it, farming is hard work today. With all the modern mechanized equipment we have, it's still hard work. And man lived by the sweat of his brow at this time. And of course, that was part of the judgment on man by God when he fell from grace in the Garden of Eden, that he would live by the sweat of his brow. So with that, we're going to pick it up today. We ask that word of wisdom in Yeshua, Jesus' precious name. Father, we ask you to open eyes, open ears this day. We're going to pick it up with the Feast of Trumpets, and Leviticus chapter 23, verse 23, and it reads, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying," introducing a new set of regulations, and as I said, concerning the Feast of Trumpets, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the month," this would be the first of Tisri on the Hebrew calendar, "shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation." And these trumpets in the Hebrew is shofar. And it was a rather large horn that many of us, I think, when we think of trumpets, we think of a smaller horn that has a pretty high note. Actually, these were thought to be fairly large horns called a shofar, and they had a very low, long-reaching bellow to them. And of course, a holy convocation at the Feast of Yahweh. These were public meetings. Usually the reading of the Word of God was prescribed for these types of meetings. Now, the 7th month, let me add Tisri, or Tisri, whichever way you prefer to pronounce it, were a very, very special month. Within this month, as we'll see in the next few scriptures, few verses, we have the Feast of Trumpets to begin. On the 10th day, we'll see the Day of Atonement, which we covered at length in chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus. Then on the 15th of Tisri, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, another 7-day feast, followed by an 8th day, which was also a Sabbath. So a very, very special time of the year. It was, I'll add too, the Feast of Tabernacles was the beginning of the ecclesiastical year, meaning anything to do with the church, the priest. That was the beginning of their year. For example, the 24 courses of the priest that we learned about in 1 Chronicles, as well as the 24 courses of the musicians, which were also Levites but not priests, and also the 24 courses of the porters, also Levites but not priests, all that served in the temple of Solomon, but they had a prescribed period of time, and the beginning of their year was at the Feast of Tabernacles. Another special thing about the 7th month was that, and within 7, of course, we have that stamp of the covenant, the number 7 also meaning spiritual completeness. A special time for the Israelites every 50th year at the Day of Atonement was also the beginning of the Jubilee year, every 50th year. More on the Jubilee when we get to chapter 25. And so then, we'll pick it up with verse 25. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And these are very briefly described here, the different feasts, and a lot more detail given in other parts of the Bible. I think the reason is this is just a summarization of how each of these feasts would fall on the calendar. The sacrifices that were made for the Feast of Trumpets were 1 oxen, 1 ram, and 7 sheep, as it's recorded in Numbers chapter 29, verses 1 through 6. Verse 26, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, and here we'll have the Day of Atonement, 10th of Tisri. Also, on the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a Day of Atonement. It shall be an holy convocation unto you. And ye shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. To afflict means, some people think it means to fast. Most definitely, I think it means to fast or humble yourself. Fasting, a means of humbling oneself before our Heavenly Father. And again, covered in great detail in chapter 16, to refresh your memory, the Day of Atonement, when the high priest of Israel would go into the Holy of Holies, the only day of the year, he being the only party that was allowed to do this without being struck dead, the high priest, to go in taking the blood of a bull and ox for his sins and the sins of Israel, and expiating or atoning for all those sins that had been unatoned for throughout the year within the nation of Israel. Also, another unique feature about the Day of Atonement, you'll remember in chapter 16 when they brought the 2 goats and they drew lots for them. One lot was cast for Yahweh, our Father. The other lot cast for Azazel, meaning the devil, or representing the devil. And then they would kill the goat that was representing the Lord as a sin offering, and the priest would place his hands on the goat's head, and then a man would take him off into the wilderness, symbolic of death, supposedly to meet his death there. Verse 28. And ye shall do no work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. And on some of the feasts, they were allowed, to tend to household things such as building a fire or cooking, things of that nature. Now, there were the Sabbaths, for example, and I believe this Day of Atonement, they were not even to build a fire or prepare food. In other words, the food would have had to have been prepared for the previous day. 29. For whatsoever soul it be that shall not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. And again, some teach that this affliction means that they were to fast, so obviously there would be no need to prepare food on this particular day. And as we'll see here in a moment, the actual day of affliction was the previous day to the Day of Atonement, which fell on the 10th and went from the evening of the 9th to the evening of the 10th, which would be the beginning on the Hebrew day of the Day of Atonement. And being cut off from people means exterminated. Verse 30. And whatsoever soul it be that doeth any work in that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among his people. That's Yahweh speaking. He would see it, and he would judge it, and he would destroy. 31. Ye shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. Verse 32. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and ye shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, shall ye celebrate your Sabbath. This word celebrate in the Hebrew is Shabbat, and it means rest. And so this actually saying, ye shall rest your rest, if it were the meaning of Sabbath, actually is rest. And again, this affliction or the fasting, the humbling of one's soul was not done on the 10th, but on the 9th, the previous day to the Day of Atonement. Verse 33. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, and now we'll see the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot in the Hebrew language, come into the subject. 34. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. And in Numbers chapter 29, verses 13 and 33, 13 through 33, we see the sacrifices that were prescribed, and there were actually sacrifices that were to be made on each day of the Feast of Tabernacles, being a 7-day feast, and including on the 8th day, which was a Sabbath, but not considered part of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, as I said a moment ago, the Hebrew word is Sukkot for the Feast of Tabernacles, and it means booths. And what you have to remember is when Israel came out of bondage, which at the time this was written would have been almost exactly a year prior, as they encamped in the wilderness, which we're talking desert. It was a harsh environment. And the booths, what were they? Well, they were protection from the heat of the day. They were protection from the rain and storms that occasionally did happen in the desert. Symbolically, I think examples of the protection that our Heavenly Father gave them as they made their way through the wilderness toward the Promised Land. Again, Sukkot meaning booths. Actually, that was the first place of encampment for Israel. The name of a location is called Sukkot when they came out of Egypt. 35. On the first day, and this is of the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles, shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, a day of rest, a Sabbath. 36. 7 days ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you. This would be the 22nd of Tisri. And ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. And ye shall do no servile work therein. This word solemn, check it out, is a day of restraint. In other words, don't do any work. And again, Feast of Tabernacles, 7 days. This 8th day was a solemn close to the cycle of feasts throughout the Hebrew calendar year. 37. These are the feast of the Lord, of Yahweh, and I'll remind you, feast meaning appointed times or appointed season, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything upon his day. And again, the seasons established, appointed by the Lord, were to remind Israel as they moved into this land, the promised land in Canaan, that they were to make sacrifices to the Lord. This, again, one of the purposes of Leviticus, showing Israel how they were to worship Yahweh, and part of that worship, the requirements of making these sacrifices to him. For if the people weren't sacrificing to him, unfortunately in many cases they would be sacrificing to other gods, small g. Verse 38. Beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and by the way, the sacrifices to be offered on the Sabbaths you'll find in Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. And beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your free will offerings, which ye give unto the Lord. In other words, these feasts are to be kept separate, the ones that we've just been discussing in this 23rd chapter. Don't think that because you're doing these other things that are mentioned in verse 38 that it lets you off the hook as far as carrying out God's instructions concerning the feast. By the way, the gifts, if you're not familiar what that would be the dedicatory gifts, such as the tribe princes offered in Numbers chapter 7. The firstlings were gifts, dedicatory gifts, tithes, heave offerings, things of this nature. 39. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when ye have gathered in the fruit of the land, the Feast of Tabernacles, also known by some as the ingathering, for this very reason that the harvest was coming to pass. Ye shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath, and to end again the cycle of the feast of the Lord. And again, at harvest, is a very joyful time for anyone that's in agriculture. It's like you're going to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labors. And I think part of the fact that the Lord brought them into the booths for 7 days, which we'll get to again here in a moment, was the simple fact of making them realize that it was He, the Lord, that made it possible for them to be enjoying the harvest. It was He, the Lord, that provided them with the materials to make booths, which protected them from the heat of day. And more importantly, He Himself was that cloud that moved along over them, protecting them from the sun in the wilderness. And by night, that pillar of fire that was, I'm sure, a comfort to them as they were out in this harsh desert. When you consider the 600,000 Israelites coming out of Egypt, and they had been in bondage for 400 years, probably had, fairly nice dwellings, and nothing, of course, like Pharaoh dwelt in, and they were the servants, but they were pretty well protected by Pharaoh, is what I'm trying to say. And for them to move out into this lonely wilderness where supposedly the evil spirits were and death was around every corner, I can imagine that pillar of fire by night was quite a comfort each night. Verse 40. And ye shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees. Check out these boughs. In the Hebrew, it's peri, which is not French for Paris, but Hebrew for fruit. And these were most likely shoots, which are young branches that shoot forth out of fruit trees, goodly trees, meaning ornamental trees, fruit trees in the garden. You could think of them, but they were probably shoots or limbs that had blossoms or actual fruit on them. Branches of palm trees. In the Hebrew life, the palm tree symbolic of life. There was a lot of folks that did not starve to death, and at this time we're talking probably about the date palm, which provided a lot of food for the Israelites. And the boughs of thick trees. This Hebrew word is anah, and it does mean heavy branches. And willows of the brook. And ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Some commentators think that God wanted to humble Israel by putting them in the booths. And I don't think God's word would say rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days if it was intended that they humble themselves. God reminding them, I took care of you for this last year. I provided you you with the scrubby, brushy material in the desert that you had to make booths. Now I'm bringing you into a land where we'll have fruit, we'll have goodly branches of bigger trees, we'll have palm branches, on and on and on. God's saying, I'm going to take care of you, and you take joy in that. As always, there are conditions. 41. And ye shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations, throughout your generations. Ye shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Again, a time of celebration, not humbling themselves. And of course, the 7th month again being Tisri on the Hebrew calendar. 42. Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths in time of plenty, and to be reminded that God provides for them. 43. That your generations, meaning your children, may know that I made, this could be translated provided, I provided the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Again, a cloud by day protecting them, a pillar of fire by night. Again, I think a big part of the instructions for the feast, when your children ask you why you do these things, tell them this is what happened, this is the history. Also, when things are going good, oftentimes, even today, we have a tendency as human beings to, when things are going good, to say, look what I did with my own 2 hands. And God making sure that they realize who it was that provides them with the harvest, that they can enjoy the fruits of their labors, who provides them with the protection, being himself represented by the booths. 44. And Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. And, we receive letters, probably, especially after we teach books such as Leviticus, anything in the law, we receive letters from people asking, well, send us a calendar on a modern day calendar when these feasts occur. And as it's written in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, that we're not to judge our brethren concerning a Sabbath or an holy day. And I certainly don't intend to judge anyone on their Sabbath or their holy day. What I would, as a pastor, ask you to do is to consider, if you had a list of these feasts, what are you going to do? On the Feast of Weeks, are you going to make 2 loaves of bread and wave them toward the Lord when He's given you the bread of life? What about the Day of Atonement? Are you going to wait for 1 day of the year for one person out of the nation, the high priest, to take blood and enter into the Holy of Holies? When Jesus Christ's blood on the cross opened that Holy of Holies for one and all. You can approach to God. That was who was in the Holy of Holies at that time when He dwelt among men. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, Paul's teaching, stating that Christ has become our Passover. And if you want to celebrate all these feasts, that's fine. You and I can still be good buddies. We're not talking about a salvation issue here. What I am trying to emphasize is that if Christ is our Passover, and He fulfilled and took the place of the first feast of the year, I, for one, am satisfied to allow Him to take the place of all the rest of the feast through the year. He replaced many of those things, the sacrifices and all this that happened on these different feast days. I'll put my rest and Sabbath as far as the Sabbaths that happened on these feast days in Jesus Christ every day, and I would encourage you to do the same. Okay, enough on that. And in chapter 24, we come to the instructions concerning the golden candlestick, and the Hebrew language, the menorah. menorah, also the showbread, which means the bread of faces, if you literally translate it, and then we'll get into, after that, the laws concerning if someone does offense to someone else's animal, and also gets into murder as we take a look at some quarreling and bickering that began in the wilderness between an Israelite and a half-Israelite. Chapter 24, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, and I think what we're going to see here is we've gone through the feast, and I think this is the reason this is plugged in right following the feast. We've seen prescribed throughout the year what feasts are to be celebrated, but this first thing is something the Israelites were to do each day to worship the Lord. And I think he's reminding us that he doesn't expect us just to go from feast to feast to feast and worship him. He expects to be worshiped and reverenced every day. Verse 2. Command the children of Israel. It's only one of two times that this appears in Leviticus. Here in chapter 6, verse 9, the word command the children of Israel that they bring unto thee pure oil olive. Now, who was it that was to bring it? The congregation. You could see this as a sacrifice on their part. Beaten for the light to cause the lamps to burn continually. And this could easily be misunderstood by the way this is translated. The golden candlestick was not to burn continually, meaning day and night. What this means is that this is a perpetual order. This is to continue on forever, but as we'll see in a moment, the golden candlestick lamps were only lit at night and burned from dusk until morning. Verse 3. Without the veil of the testimony, this being the curtain that separated the outer court from, or I should say the inner court from the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Testament or Ark of the Covenant was. In the tabernacle of the congregation shall Aaron, this the high priest, order it from the evening unto the morning before the Lord continually. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. And the golden candlestick, symbolic of many things. I can think of it as a type. Number one, as the chosen nation of God, you could see the manifestation of the nation of Israel in this golden candlestick when it was lit at night. In that, what is light? Light is symbolic of knowledge and truth. Jesus, of course, being the light of the world, that truth, that knowledge. Also, it was a seven-branched candlestick, the menorah. In Zechariah chapter 4, a great deal of prophecy there concerning the two witnesses and the 7,000 elect. Each one of these branches of these seven-branched golden candlestick representing the elect, God's 7,000 elect. The two witnesses were providing the oil. You see here, man was responsible for bringing the oil, but when we get to the point that the two witnesses appear on earth, it will be God providing the oil, the truth, through his two, as it's stated in the Hebrew in Zechariah chapter 4, the last verse, through his sons of oil. Those two olive trees mentioned also in Revelation chapter 11, verse 4. He shall order the lamps upon the pure candlestick before the Lord continually, to be there always, lighting, showing the world that this is a people that has truth. This is a people that has light, lighting up the darkness of the world. Now we come to the showbread, and again, the showbread literally translated, it means bread of faces, and you could think of of this in several ways. I like to think of it that it is a bread that through the use of it, you were allowed to approach the face of God. The priests were at this time. Of course, a normal man would have been struck dead on the spot, although now that Christ has rent that veil, we also have that opportunity. Verse 5, "And thou shalt take the fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. 2/10 deals shall be in 1 cake." An ordinary meal offering would be 1/10 deal, so we see a little more required for each of these cakes than the normal meal offering. And again, it was the fine flour. It had to be provided by the people. They brought it to the priest, so a little bit of a sacrifice we see there. And this is how they were expected to worship. Also instructions for the priest concerning the showbread, verse 6. "And thou shalt set them in 2 rows, this addressed to Aaron, the high priest, 6 on a row upon the pure table before the Lord." And the pure table meaning nothing more than it's been ceremonially cleansed, as Moses cleansed the tabernacle, you'll recall, in one of our earlier chapters. Now this 2 rows, probably better understood if we translated it 2 piles, 2 stacks, maybe even a better word, of 6. In other words, and if you have a Smith's Bible Dictionary, I would suggest you look up the showbread. It's interesting to read, plus they have an artist rendition of drawing of the artist perception of what the table of showbread with the bread stacked on 2 stacks of 6. The numbers, in this significant. We have a total of 12 cakes, 12 being spiritual completeness, also 1 cake for each tribe you could think of. 2, all in biblical numerics, is unity or witness, and 6 is always the weakness of man, something we should remind ourselves of a little more often than we do. Verse 7, "And thou shalt put pure frankincense," and this is just incense you could think of, "upon each row or stack, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord." And the incense or frankincense, always symbolic of prayer. Now the incense, although it states here that you'll put it on the bread for a memorial, that just doesn't quite add up in my mind, because as we'll see in a moment, the priests were to eat the showbread after it was taken out of service, after which we'll find out was from Sabbath to Sabbath. According to Josephus, who is you could think of as a historical biblical writer, the incense was actually kept in golden saucers, and we'll see at the end of the week the incense was burned and offered to the Lord, and then the priests were required to eat the showbread. Verse 8, "Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant." Again, seeing this required of Aaron on each Sabbath day, and this was a gesture of worship and sacrifice even on the part of the people. Verse 9, and then we'll stop for today. "And it shall be Aaron's and his sons, and they shall eat it in the holy place, for it is most holy unto him of the offerings of the Lord made by fire by a perpetual statute." One of the 4 most holy things. This reminded me of 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David, you recall, when he was on the run from Saul, he went to the priest Ahimelech, and there was nothing in the house to eat. Nob is the location where this was, and the priest gave of David the showbread to eat, because that was all there was to eat. Unfortunately, there was a man by the name of Doeg there who, upon Saul's urging, ended up going back to Nob and killing Ahimelech's entire family, 85 priests. Only one of his entire family was left. We'll come back in our next lecture and complete chapter 24. Again, chapter 25, we'll get into the sabbatical year and the Jubilee. Jubilee being a very interesting time. I hope you'll be listening in for that. We've got a short message. We'll ask you to listen a moment.